Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nikole Killion. I am a CBS News Congressional Correspondent, and as you can see, I am joining you from Capitol Hill, so I apologize if you hear any ambient noise in the background, but certainly bear with us. Certainly happy to join you on this evening and to serve as your moderator for our panel discussion this evening entitled Preserving the Homefront, Stories to be Told About Homeowner Inequities, 20 Years Post-Katrina. Of course, this is powered by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And believe it or not, it's hard to believe that it's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina. Of course, 2025 will mark that 20th anniversary of the devastation that was brought all across the Gulf Coast region. And so in advance of next month's Super Bowl in New Orleans, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is partnering with athlete ambassadors as well as with media organizations for important conversations on home preservation. So again, we want to thank everybody who's out there tonight and joining us. Just to give you a rundown of this discussion, we will touch on a number of things, including reflecting on the panelists' personal experiences. We will talk about how federal relief efforts affected many households in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and many other natural disasters that followed. And also we'll discuss the far-reaching and long-lasting impact of Hurricane Katrina. This dialogue will also explore the importance of financial literacy, as well as bring awareness to the concept of tangled titles and heirs property, which have disproportionately impacted communities of color across the Gulf Coast region. So again, want to thank everybody who is joining us tonight, including our panelists, and most especially, we want to give a special thanks and shout out to the National Association of Black Journalists, as well as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for making this event possible. I also just want to go over a brief housekeeping rule as we continue this discussion. I'm sure many of you out there will have questions for our panelists, and so there will be a time for that. We just ask that you put any questions that you have into the chat using the Q&A function on your screens. And we also would like to remind you to please use your name and outlet when you submit your questions. At this time, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists, beginning with Ruth Gao. She is the Associate General Counsel of Impact Investment for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She advises the Impact Investments team in the structuring and deployment of program-related investments, contracts, grants, and other funding. She also supports several other departments in the foundation's philanthropic activities. Ruth has over a decade of experience representing investors and investment managers, both here in the United States and internationally. From a global nonprofit investment firm to private practice, she has also provided pro bono legal services for various not-for-profits as well as small organizations. Ruth graduated from New York University School of Law with a Juris Doctor degree, as well as from the University of Michigan Ross School of Business with a Bachelor of Business Administration. Next up, we have Demario Davis. He is an NFL linebacker. You may recognize him from the New Orleans Saints, and he continues to make his mark both on and off the field. He is originally from Brandon, Mississippi. Demario played college football for Arkansas State. He was selected in the third round of the 2012 NFL draft by the New York Jets. His playing career includes stints with the Jets as well as the Cleveland Browns. And of course, he has been playing with the Saints since 2018. In addition, Demario is a two-time Pro Bowl selection and winner of the 2021 Bart Starr Award. He and his wife, Tamala, founded the Devoted Dreamers Foundation. They started that back in 2013 to, quote, equip the next generation of leaders with the tools to be successful spiritually, mentally, and physically. He's also a member of the Players Coalition, which exists to end social injustices and racial inequities. Next up, please welcome Sharonda Williams. She is in the top upper corner of your screen. She has consistently served the public and citizens of New Orleans, as well as the state of Louisiana, throughout her legal career. She is the Vice President, General Counsel, and Director of Government Affairs for Loyola University. In addition, Sharonda is also a board president for Louisiana Appleseed, which is a nonprofit, and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation community partner that is dedicated to helping organize, establish, and guide a network of public interest law centers throughout the country to provide advocacy that promotes systemic change. Prior to joining the administration of Loyola University, Sharonda was special counsel at Fishman Haygood LLP in New Orleans. She also rejoined the firm as special counsel and previously served as board counsel for the Orleans Parish School Board, as well as senior chief deputy city attorney for the city of New Orleans. And she has also served as city attorney both in 2011 through 2013 and 2013 through 2015. So doing several stints there. And now to pivot to our discussion. First of all, once again, welcome to our panelists. We'll give you a virtual round of applause. And of course, now we want to move forward with our discussion. So, in terms of this conversation that we're having, there is certainly a belief that everyone here in America deserves a fair and just opportunity to thrive, to plan for the future, as well as to position their children and families for success in their own lives. And of course, home can be that first step to getting there. Home preservation is also an issue that affects all communities, as we know, from estate planning to financial literacy. Cultivating and protecting your homestead, of course, can be a very layered and complex process with a number of variables that people don't always know exist. So within the realm of home preservation, for instance, you have tangled titles or heirs property, such as land that was passed down to descendants without legal documentation. That is something that is widespread in many urban and rural communities throughout the Southeast. And it's disproportionately found in low-income ethnic and racial minority families who may be less likely to have a will or transfer their property prior to death. We know that this issue can be further compounded when natural or home disasters strike and residents look to untangle property claims and ownership, which is something we're also more than likely witnessing now as we, watch these wildfires out in Southern California. So certainly not just limited to what's happening and what has happened in Louisiana, but, I want to use that as a jumping off point to you, Ruth, if you can kind of just explain some of that terminology that I just went through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And really glad to be here with everyone tonight. So you've heard the term heirs property and tangled titles several times at this point. What this is really a term used to describe parcels of land, residential, agricultural, vacant land that's inherited by the descendants or designated inheritors of a previous owner. Essentially, the property is passed down without a properly administered will or an estate that clearly indicates the next of kin or the designated heirs. And then that happens again with the next set of owners over successive generations. And without a clear title, without your name on the deed to the property, you hold the title, you hold the property without clear title. And you're known, these holders are then known as tenants in common. Tenants in common is a form of ownership that's really precarious, where you can have two tenants in common, then you have to make a decision, or you may be in a situation where there are 100 people, possibly over 3 or 4 generations, your cousins, your third cousins, you're all tenants in common over this property. And in order to do anything with the property, you have to make decisions unanimously. And that's why this form of ownership is difficult to maintain. Separately speaking, we've seen this issue of tangled titles really disproportionately affect Black and Brown families due to inequitable access to legal services and persistent discrimination that has over generations broken the trust that families have in these systems that govern and were meant to protect property ownership. Oftentimes, families were in turn exploited by the court system, by the lawyers and the accountants that they thought to protect their property, but rather lost it through those avenues. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has also recognized heirs property as the leading cause of Black involuntary land loss. One statistic that's often shown is, African American farm landowners acquired about 16 million acres of farmland between 1865 to 1910. Okay, that was a very long time ago. But if you look at 2017 data, now there are only about 2.9 million acres held by African American farm land owners. So that's from 16 million to 2.9. This drastic loss of land happened in the last century in the US. Another statistic that I think helps to highlight the significance of this situation is that more than about a third of Southern Black-owned land may be subject to heirs property, or may be heirs property, excuse me. And a very conservative estimate of the market value of that land is about $28 billion today. So without a will, a property is not legally transferred at the owner's death to the persons occupying the home, and the occupants are not on the home's title. Without your name on a title, you're unable to access many government-funded programs aimed to aid homeowners, such as property tax abatements, assessment relief, but also, as Nikole mentioned, in the wake of natural disasters that have happened, a lot of federal grant dollars to assist after a natural disaster were originally denied to people who could not demonstrate that they had clear title to their homes. And that really happened in Katrina. And we'll go into this later in the conversation as well. But also, without a clear title to your home, you can't use that to unlock government funding. You can't use that to secure a loan on your property, like a HELOC, to borrow against that for property improvements or starting a business, and to continue to build wealth within your generation and across future generations. So those are just some basics of heirs property.
Yeah, and some pretty stunning statistics there in terms of the ownership, land ownership and home ownership that you referenced. So Demario, I want to turn to you just kind of to talk more about the personal impact. If you can tell us about some of the individuals you have encountered that have experienced natural disasters.
Yes, thank you, Nikole. You did an amazing job of leading us to this point. Thank you, and Ruth did a great job of going through a lot of the statistics that we are facing. So I have a little familiarity in dealing with areas that have been impacted by natural disaster. Growing up in Mississippi, I remember Katrina and how close it was and how we were impacted with everything that went on. And now playing here, I was in New Jersey when Sandy hit out there. I traveled to Flint, Michigan to deal with the water crisis. And then you look around, this year has been very disastrous. Just you look at what happened in Florida, we look at what happened in the Carolinas, look what's going on in LA, look what happened in Houston. And so it's been, I think this is a great time to be having this conversation about disaster relief and what happens with home. But I really think you have to go back to what Ruth just talked about and those statistics about tangled titles and heirs property, and really understanding how that even happens, especially in poor communities. Because you would think, like, how does somebody not have a title or clear ownership of their home? Well, when you have to understand in poor communities, which are predominantly Black and brown communities, a lot of people are in survival mode. They are not in thrive mode. You only get to estate planning, drawing up wills, thinking about future generations when you get to a thrive place, when you get to a place of where you know You're not worried about living check to check. You're not worried about putting food on the dinner table just for today. We'll figure out tomorrow, the next day. And that's where a lot of these families live. And so when someone passes away, a lot of times they don't even have life insurance. They haven't even planned their funeral, let alone thought about how to transfer the estate properly, not thinking about how it's going to impact. And the next generation that receives it, they may just see it as this was mama's house, this was daddy's house, this was grandma's house. It's just a house that's been in our family, and we're just holding on to it. And then disaster strikes. And now you're sitting in a situation where your house has been impacted by a hurricane, your house has been impacted by a tornado. It could be fires, as we see now. And when you get ready to go and get relief or get some type of aid, and they're asking for your documentation, well, the proper documentation isn't there. And most people don't even realize that these people can't get the relief that they need. It's people also to understand that people may be staying in zones where they can get property tax relief. They can't get that. So imagine somebody who's already living, check to check in survival mode that can't get relief and aid that the government has set aside. So I think that this is a very serious issue when you think about, especially African-American communities, when you think about the wealth gap that exists in our country. Well, when you understand that about $28 billion of Southern land is in tangled titles or heirs property, how do you think that's going to impact the community as a whole? And so these are some of the issues that I think a lot of times aren't talked about. It's people who are marginalized and it's not thought about, but these are real people whose lives are being impacted every day. And I see these faces, I see these people in the community. A lot of the young kids that we work with in our programs, they're coming from these homes, right? I can look at them and pretty much assume, not knowing all the business, that it's a high chance that the paperwork for their home doesn't have proper documentation, but it's a house that they own. And it's a house that they're living in. It's a house they go, from the time they were little kids to the time they go off to college, this is the place they call home. But if they go to submit paperwork and receive aid, if something comes up like a disaster that's outside of your control, you look at, I'm hearing stories of people in LA, and we are definitely praying for those people. But a lot of those people can pay money and go stay somewhere else. And when everything is fixed and put back together, they'll just be able to return home to a new place or an improved place. Not that it's not tragic, but imagine someone who doesn't have that documentation who will never be able to return. And then that land is going to be lost. And that's what Ruth was talking about it being the #1 involuntary loss of African-American land is through tangled titles. And so this is a very critical issue and a very important issue to talk about, because these are lives that we're talking about that are being significantly impacted, and whole communities that are being impacted by this.
And so Sharonda, talk to us about what people need to know. Just in terms of changing the cycle around some of this to prevent this from happening to other families. What do people out there need to know?
So I think you've heard it now a couple of times from both Ruth and Demario about the importance, and what is most effective and important is just the idea of estate planning. And some people in certain communities and who might not think that they have enough wealth to even take the step of doing estate planning. If you've got property, that is really important to take the step to get a will drafted. And so we at Appleseed are very focused on encouraging people to get a will done. We ask and
interject, how do you get those conversations started? Because I do feel like sometimes it's a very sensitive topic for many people and for many families to even broach that idea, right?
And Right. And we'll talk about a little bit later some of our work around the Super Bowl. We're kind of rebranding the idea of drafting wills because a lot of people don't even want to think about end of life planning, right? But it is about building wealth and ensuring that your wealth is preserved as well. And so the spin on it is wealth building and wealth preservation, and not the idea of end of life planning. And so we're encouraging people to draft wills. And in preparation for those sessions and meeting with attorneys and legal aid services, compiling lists of assets so that it makes the conversation easier when there's an attorney in your presence helping you draft it. We also do will writing clinics, and we have one coming up right before the Super Bowl on February 1st. We'll be doing 2 informational sessions on will writing. But then people will also have the opportunity to meet with an attorney and get a will drafted and notarized at those clinics. And to kind of drive the point home a little bit more, we have basically determined the statistics show that legal aid in our state drafts about a little more than 300 wills annually. But we figured out that there's a way to put a technology spin on it and increase the number of wills and basically double the number of wills that those services could provide. So in 2024, Appleseed partnered with Louisiana Land Lab, which is a tech-centered company that helps with civil aid. And they've generated something that we're calling the will generator. And we're using it, and the idea is to use it at law clinics for will drafting and for legal aid services to have access to this technology to be able to make will drafting more efficient for them so more people can get wills done quickly. And I know we'll get to a conversation about resources later, but if people are interested in seeing just sort of the technology aspect of that, there is a YouTube video where the creator of the app actually went through it and did a little demo that's available on YouTube. And if you just do a search for will generator, you'll find it for people who are interested in that level of detail about it.
And so, Ruth, I want to just turn back to you since we have a lot of journalists listening in tonight. And speaking as a journalist myself, this is obviously a very complex yet important topic, when we're talking about this issue of heirs properties and home ownership. And for those of us who may want to do a deep dive into our coverage, kind of what advice or guidance might you provide? Because at the same time, we're often very limited, right? Like, I know in television, sometimes I only get 1:30 to tell the story. For some of my print colleagues, you might be limited to 500 words, hopefully more for a subject like this. But, when you're kind of looking for those angles beyond, the tragedy, the natural disaster that may have just occurred, you're kind of looking for more of those in-depth beats to get into. What guidance do you have for journalists when covering this particular issue?
Yeah, thank you. And, just kind of building on the conversation that we've been having, there's two sides of this coin, right? And I love what Sharonda was saying and that Appleseed is doing in rebranding this as a wealth preservation, a wealth generation opportunity, rather than look at all of the exploitation and the loss and the disasters, which is driven by fear, right? Like, if you don't want to lose your home, you gotta be aware of the situation, which I think is really important, because that's the truth. Like, this has happened. This has been historically, families have been exploited. Deeds have been stolen, right? Deeds used to be still they're on pieces of paper. And in the past, when deeds have been stolen, families have no other recourse to find that, right? And so I think culturally over time, rather than leaving it to the courts and administering a will, a lot of families decided, let me just keep it in the family. When I pass away, let my children or my nephews and nieces take this house and live in it. And that way we can preserve it because it's in the family, right? Like what Demario was saying. But what we have found is that there are, developers and very opportunistic and often profit-driven actors out there who have sought to exploit the construct of a tenant in common, right? Where these properties have now been kept in a family, multiple people, whether they live there or not, kind of have shared ownership over it. Before I start to explain where I'm going with that, I think the caution is, how do we frame, like, how can reporters frame this issue so that we highlight the importance of preserving your home rather than create opportunities for more exploitation to happen for these communities, right? And so that's kind of the caution I want to throw out there for everyone. And if you all allow, I just want to spend a second on this construct of deed theft and this concept of partition. When tenants in common, there could be 10 people, 100 people, however many there are, everyone holds an equal share of a property, but that property is transferable. And so what we've seen, you may have seen on the streets, like cash for cars, right? Or cash for your home, or there are all these different schemes that were implemented over time to say, buy a share of Cousin Joe's property. He maybe is a part owner in this home. I live in New York, and so I'll use Brooklyn as an example. Like a townhome in Brooklyn is now probably worth $1 million to $2 million, where it used to be, very, very affordable. But Cousin Joe and his other family members all kind of own a part of this house. But a developer comes along and say, hey, Joe, I know that you have about 10% of this house. I'm going to give you $50,000 in cash right now if you give me your ownership interest. Technically, his interest could be worth, $100,000, $200,000, but Cousin Joe is like, well, cash now is better than trying to deal with my family to try to get money out of this house. So let me sell my share. With that interest that this developer bought, a third party that's unrelated to anyone else that lives in the house, depends on the house, has been there for generations, has had their kids grow up there. Like this developer who has a minority interest, doesn't live there, can bring to the court what we call a partition action. And what that means is a tenant in common can say, I need to get my share of this property and be done with in separate ways, right? In theory, right, when it's a piece of land, you think, okay, we can divide this land into 10 ways and everyone will have an equal value in what they receive. Maybe the size is different, but this is more fertile, this one has a well. You can technically, in theory, divide the land. But if you look at a brownstone in Brooklyn, you can't say Joe gets this room, Lucy gets the kitchen, right? And so the court, in reality, then will take that and say, well, what we do is we're going to sell this house and give everyone their dollar amount worth of share. And so what happens is that the families, often these court processes are not well run. They're often exploited. There's insiders, right, that are in on this. And the house or the property gets sold way below market value. But there's nothing that the family could do because the family couldn't really pay back or buy it back for themselves. And what they end up with are pennies on the dollar for what their property is worth. And now they can't afford another place to live. And we see this happening in homes, in farmland, in other, properties. And so I think there's just a lot of caution I'd like to put out there. So for how we describe this, so that we don't encourage more people to engage in this type of exploitation.
And then just, Sharonda, if you can also touch on government policies that are out there, I guess, for those who may be covering this more from the legislative or policy perspective, what types of government policies are in place or resources might be in place to help families.
Well, it's a great segue from what Ruth just described, the circumstances that she described about these partitions and the partition sales. So in 2010, the Uniform Law Commission promulgated what's called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. As of May 2024, 22 states and the District of Columbia had adopted it. We in Louisiana have been working on this by virtue of a state house resolution since 2021, along with our law institute here. And so the value of this act is that it does three really important things. One, if there are all these co-tenants, for instance, the developer that Ruth just described, if they come to court and say, I want to basically sell this property, then the other co-tenants have to be given the opportunity to buy them out as opposed to forcing a sale. Second, it requires that the properties be sold sort of for commercially reasonable prices and on the open market. So you don't get this auction type sale for pennies on the dollar, which is really very important. And then the other thing is that the courts are now allowed to look at other factors, not just economics, but if there's property in a family that has some sort of cultural or historical or emotional value, then the court can look at that and then basically split up the property if that's, something that's able to be done by looking at all these other factors. So that body of law kind of changes the partition environment so that you don't have these forced auction sales where people are getting pennies on the dollar for their property. And as I said, we're still working on it here in Louisiana, and I think other states are continuing to look at it too, but that's an important piece of legislation for this issue.
And Demario, can you drill down a little bit more for us about some of the implications that are out there for homeowners?
Yeah, I think it's been said on this call. I'm so grateful for Ruth and Sharonda sharing their expertise, because you don't have to listen long to really hear the implications. I mean, look what Ruth described as a townhouse in the Bronx going for now versus what it would have went 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. Well, let's talk 3 generations ago, right? So when you talk about generating wealth for a family, I don't think it can be talked about without thinking about home ownership and how much being able to buy a home or being able to maintain a home or hold on to a home and passing it down to a generation, what that means for you and your family. I mean, you just look at today's market and inflation, and you don't have to look long to understand how much having a property and the value of it going up and how much it's going to impact your family, but also how easy it can be lost. And, being able to be aware, right? Financial literacy, as it was talked about earlier, but also to be able to be applied in understanding, doing advanced financial planning, writing a will, paying taxes, putting together a family tree, doing these things that, making sure that all your documentation is in place if something was to come up, because what that means, not just for you and your family, but for future generations. I think that is so critical. Another thing is our homes affect our health. Where we live is so much about how we feel about ourselves, about our day-to-day interactions. It's where we come back home to. It's our place of peace. And so what owning a home, being an owner of a home, what that does for us psychologically, what it does for us mentally. But you have to think about we live where we can afford to live. And so imagine that scenario that's being played out about people who don't have cash on hand ready. And then now they're being taken to court. How long do you think they're going to be able to survive in court with those bills stacking up? And so it just becomes a continuum of a problem that just pushes people deeper into debt, deeper into poverty, deeper into struggle, deeper into anguish. And you just see a perpetual problem. And so if it impacts this generation, just like if you hold on to a home and you're able to pass it down generation to generation, how much that blesses the generation, how much do losses impact generations in that family. And so when you're talking home ownership, this is a very important conversation, not just due to how it's compounded with natural disasters, as we were talking about earlier, but just in general. And so when we're talking about fighting for stronger communities and better communities, you cannot have that conversation without talking about better, more equitable housing practices. And
Yeah,
so,
and I guess,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll let you finish your point.
Oh, good. You good.
No, I was going to say, yeah, if you can just maybe kind of walk us though through that fine line. I think taking, the natural disasters out of the equation. I mean, I think, when you look at communities, particularly many historic communities of color, when you talk about issues, for instance, of gentrification, there's still that delicate balance when you're talking about passing down that home versus, yeah, but I could probably get about $1 million for it right now because of the market, because you talked about some of the market factors. So I guess when you're having some of these conversations with families about preserving wealth, talk to us a little bit about that dilemma that some individuals may face.
Yeah, that's a real conversation and something that has to be discussed when you're talking about more equitable practices. So you want someone to think long term, but they're in day-to-day survival mode. It's not a reality for them, right? It's just like when you think about the education system. I use a different analogy in the education system. How's somebody going to focus on doing classwork for 6 hours a day when they don't know where they're going to eat? They don't know if they're going to go home and a parent is getting abused. They don't know if they're going to get abused when they get home. They don't know if they're going to be faced with guns or drugs when they go home. How do you expect them to focus for 6 hours? And so it's an indirect result. And so when someone's living day to day, it's hard for them to think long term to the next generation. They're just trying to make it to tomorrow. And so this is why you see a lot of these estate planning isn't done. Now, I think so that's two different conversations. There has to be someone helping bend the limbs down so that someone can reach the apple. Understanding their situation, that's the empathy that we have to have. But also, people have to have a bit of working with what you got. As Sharonda talked about, there are things that are being in place to write a will, making sure you're staying up to date on your taxes. You staying current on your taxes on the property, putting together documentation, all the resources that you have to put together a family tree to be able to prove that the place you stay in. If you don't have these things, start working on getting all the paperwork just in case something happens, that you're not put in this situation, creating a paper trail, consolidating ownership so that what Ruth talked about earlier doesn't become a thing. Figuring out a way if you may want to put it into a land trust or LLC. Tracking expenses that you're paying, any improvements that you're doing to the property, whether you're upgrading the house or doing some type of landscaping or something like that. So being able to track that so that if you ever need to be able to approve document that you don't face risk of losing it. So I think it's on both sides, but that is a very real question that you asked. And it is very hard for someone to think long term when their short term is so drastic.
I do want to take this time to remind those of you who are out there, again, if you have questions, to please put them into the chat. We will be getting to the Q&A portion of our program shortly. So I know for the journalists out there, hopefully you have many, but we would like to just pause and ask that you post those questions in the chat at this time. I do want to keep the conversation going, though, because as we mentioned at the top of this panel, of course, a lot of eyes are going to be on New Orleans in the coming weeks as it prepares to host the Super Bowl. And so, Sharonda, I do want to turn back to you in terms of, story topics for those of us who are journalists looking for story ideas beyond who's going to win the game and who's performing and who's doing the halftime show. But what other topics can a journalist explore around the time of the Super Bowl there in New Orleans?
So I mentioned before that we're framing this idea of estate planning about around the idea of wealth building. But Appleseed has been working with the Players Coalition, and the Players Coalition has been a great support in some of the initiatives around estate planning and will writing. So on February 6th, Appleseed and the Players Coalition are doing an event, a Radio Row media event, but it's basically being framed as building Black wealth and a convening on building Black wealth. We'll have a number of panelists who will be Kelvin Beecham, Malcolm Jenkins, Professor Thomas Mitchell from the Boston College of Law, who's a national expert on heirs property, and our executive director, Adrienne Wheeler. And so the discussion about heirs property and what estate planning needs to be done to sort of ensure that heirs property issue isn't affecting people will be discussed at that event, and that's on February 6th. We've also done a number of PSAs in collaboration with members of the Players Coalition. We have some that are going to be broadcast and that we'll be putting out there, some 15-second, but they are all focused on basically educating people on the UPHPA, which we discussed a moment ago, some of the legal clinics that we're doing on will writing. And so those things are out there as well in collaboration with our friends at the Players Coalition. So we thank them for that help.
Sorry, Ruth, I know we have some other resources out there as well. I believe we have a slide. I don't know if you can talk us through some of those additional resources and organizations that are out there that journalists can use as potential sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're at a point in time where a lot of research, a lot of work has been done, but this is a time where we're starting to see it bubble up in more conversations and more in different contexts. I think this used to be much more of a legal and individual issue, but we're starting to see the connection between health, community, wealth, and all of that. And so I just want to highlight that we'll share this PowerPoint, this deck with the attendees tonight. There are people who are researching this from a policy perspective. There are on-the-ground organizations like the Appleseed and Center for Heirs Property Preservation that are providing on-the-ground work, but also really, thought leaders in this area. This deck also has several organizations that we know this is not an exhaustive list, but just some that, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's working with, but also others that are leaders in this space. And let's see, I think the next slide, there are some universities who are providing law clinics, and while training law students, they are also providing pro bono services to families in certain areas. And there are a few funders, including RWJF, who are working to tackle this issue. So I wanted to highlight that. There's another, related to one of the questions in the Q&A box, there's also a website that I didn't include there called Death and Dirt, created by Mavis Gregg, who's also a practitioner and also someone who's thinking about using AI and technology to assist in the title clearing process. Deathanddirt.com. If I may just touch on that, the title clearing process can be costly, and that's why I think it's also been prohibitive for a lot of families that come across this issue in a time of distress that makes it harder to clear the title. Very basically, the process is you have to generate a family tree to figure out all the people since the last person who's the name on the deed who have claim to the land. And then from there, you have to then go to court to figure out that process, come to a consensus on who all the owners are, and then figure out what the title is. So, and I'm oversimplifying this process, but I think even just highlighting that getting everyone that's on a family tree that may go back 3 or 4 generations or 5 generations is an incredibly time consuming and difficult task. And then to get everyone to agree on what to do with a property is even more difficult. So there are organizations like Louisiana Appleseed, different law centers, legal aids that can provide way more assistance on that.
Excellent. And again, just a reminder to those of you who have questions out there to please put them in the chat and also include your name and affiliation. I do want to start with some of the questions that we are starting to get, and thank you again for those. And I will let any of our panelists jump in and respond as they see fit. But our first question is anonymous, but they would like to know, how can we have Black newspapers included in new distribution?
I'm not a media person, so I may not fully understand the question, but is it talking about how we get stories or information picked up by different newspapers?
I might just ask that person maybe to clarify their question unless someone from NABJ wants to jump in.
Yeah.
All right, well, maybe we'll try to come back to that, but I would ask maybe if you can just clarify your question so we can provide you the best answer. But I do want to move on with our, I think NABJ is going to hitch up in the chat box, so take a look there. But while they are doing that, I want to move on to our next question, which is from Wayne Clark. And he would like to know, he says that he is a real estate broker, and he says that another problem we have is loss of property due to property tax sales. How can we expand information sessions within the community, like churches and PSAs? He also says that he's willing to help with this. Any of our panelists want to weigh in there?
I'll just weigh in to say that we have at Appleseed kind of heard through other legal aid organizations in our city and our state that there are people in our state who are having the same issue in terms of property tax sales or potential property tax sales, because I mean, there are issues related to homestead exemptions and taxes that are accumulating because the title may not be clear. And so those are real issues. And Mr. Clark's comment is very on point, and we would love to have as many hands on deck as we try to attack this issue. So if there's a way to get us contact information, I'd be happy to take it down.
Great. And also, Demario, I wanted to see if maybe you wanted to weigh in on that. I know you work with a lot of different entities. I don't know if you specifically work with any churches or other organizations, but if you can kind of speak to some of the work that you've done on the ground, or, you know, the types of groups and organizations you tend to partner with.
Yeah, I think I traditionally try to follow a same formula, you know, when working through different issues. My biggest role a lot of times is being a voice for the voiceless and being an amplifier for those who are really doing change and really doing the work. So I'm so grateful for people like Ruth, Sharonda, yourself, and the work that's being done on the ground. I think number one, being educated on the issues that are going on. So becoming aware of a lot of these things, such as heirs property, understanding property tax sales, getting educated on that, then identifying the groups that are doing the real work. And I believe in bridges versus barriers. A lot of times you see a lot of work, people working in silos, but figuring out ways to come together and do work with people who are doing work is going to multiply the impact and effect. That's what we've done with Players Coalition. We've been able to go and identify the people who are doing real change, and we just partner with them, and it accelerates. It accelerates the work, it accelerates the impact. You get a wider reach, you get a deeper reach. and then just educating others, bringing others along. We don't work in silos, and everybody has a different role, and we need everybody. And so, big, small, white, brown, mid class, lower class, doesn't matter. We need everybody. Everybody needs to be able to pick up a shovel. And so that's really the formula that we do, is just being educated, identifying the people who are doing work, find a way to build a bridge, and then, you know, bring another along. And so it's been very effective.
Thank you for that. I want to move on to our next question, which is from Greg Childress. He is with a North Carolina Newsline. He's based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. He asks, and this might be good for you, Ruth, is there a path to title for families that find themselves without one? If so, how do they attain a title?
The answer is absolutely yes. It just depends on how high or burdensome, you know, the threshold is for the family to endure. There have been studies in Philadelphia that have shown that the average cost to clear a title through the court process is $8,000 to $10,000. So it's not insignificant by any means, especially for families who are in financial distress. But it is absolutely doable, and there are legal aid organizations, again, and pro bono or low cost services that may be available to help.
Great. I want to turn to our next question. This is probably best for you, Sharonda. And that question comes from another anonymous attendee, but they would like to know, is Louisiana Appleseed or another entity still working on helping to adjudicate properties affected by Hurricane Katrina?
I think that we have lawyers who are pro bono volunteers who work on a variety of issues. So if there are people who still have those types of issues related to adjudicated properties, they should contact us. And if it's not Appleseed, then we have other partners that we may be able to direct them to.
And then we have another question now from H.Z. Anderson. He has two questions, or this person has two questions, so I'm going to combine the two. But the first is, what is the difference or value of putting property into a trust versus a will? And then they offer this scenario: say you've been paying property taxes on a relative's home. What else should you do to try to gain ownership? Anyone have some thoughts there?
Well, I would just say that I'm looking at the question about the paying the property taxes and ownership. I just want to caution that paying property taxes doesn't necessarily confer ownership on the person who's paying the taxes. So if you're trying to gain ownership of the property, then it needs to be clear in the title that you are the owner, whether that is getting the relative to transfer the title over to you or something of that nature. But just paying the property taxes won't be sufficient.
And then adding to that part about a trust versus just in a will, it's easier to pass on to it's easier to pass it on to a beneficiary. And so it may not just be the home, it may be many things. So you don't have to figure out how to itemize each thing as to where it's going. If you were to consolidate a house into a trust that may have other things, then all you have to do is designate a beneficiary, and then that person, it'll be passed on to be documented, which will prevent and it will make it a little bit tougher for that person to lose the property.
And then this is a question for any of the panelists from Kareem White, who asks, regarding heirs property, are there any specific tips that you can provide to keep everyone on the same page in order to safeguard from families losing their property?
I can start. I mean, I think prevention is an often kind of, preventative measures, like when you first buy the house, even, right? When you're a first time home, or, you're purchasing a home, and off the bat, just starting with a will or putting it in a trust, or setting up an estate plan. It's good hygiene in that way. But I think if you're asking about tips for if you're already on property that you want to prevent, I mean, the sooner you start to go through the process to make sure that you have clear title, the better. I don't know if Sharonda or Demario, you have other things to add. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And that's another reason where a trust could be very beneficial. You know, like families that have multiple siblings, and it's been left and passed down to a generation, and so it's a family house. And one way is if everyone can come on the same page. It would probably be best if it was consolidated to one person being the designator of what goes on. It's just going to make transferring that title easier. But sometimes that can be a very complicated conversation. And so what may better to be created is a trust, and multiple people's names can be on the trust. And then you can designate a beneficiary of that trust. And so that's another reason where a trust can be more beneficial than a will, because someone is going to have to be in a trust. You're going to have to name an executor, and so everyone's can be on the trust, but there's going to be a person that's responsible for executing, and then you're going to have to designate a beneficiary, and so it can streamline something and prevent kind of what Ruth talked about, somebody may be bought out, and it creates a whole another level of issues. Because when you talk about a long-term versus somebody dealing with day-to-day, if somebody shows up with cash to the right person, all family members don't think the same. And so that's something that you rather deal with prior to a disaster happening, not just a natural disaster, but a conflict happening with family members, which happens. And so that is something to really put a lot of thought into. As Ruth said, it's a different conversation if you're a first-time homeowner. It's just make sure you get all your paperwork, and you're now learning the importance of getting that done. But if you are in a situation where you have a house that's a family house and multiple people name on it, but there is no person, it's not consolidated as one person being designated to handle all the responsibilities there and have the proper documentation with their name on it, then you may want to put it in a trust.
All right, and if we can squeeze in one last final question here from Candace Semyon, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. She just referred to Ruth's comments about the challenge of having generations decide or agree on the uses of land. And so she asked, would establishing a family trust mediate that before additional generations are birthed, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything that Demario just mentioned speaks to that. There was a previous question from Candace as well about Black newspapers, print specifically, included in the media distribution of news events. So RWJF is a funder for many Black outlets, such as Capital B, that cover topics such as home ownership, but also this webinar specifically was put together with kind of raising this issue, and so that we're hoping that many of you who are hearing this for the first time may become more interested in looking into it, researching and writing about it, so that, as a trusted resource for your communities, you can help educate the public on this issue.
Excellent. Well, we will leave it there because we are right at time. In TV news, they would say wrap it up. So we're kind of right at that moment. But we really want to thank everybody out there who participated in the conversation. Thank you for such insightful questions. And thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate your expertise and insight on this topic and hope it's something that will assist for those journalists out there in your coverage going forward. Again, we will try to send out a follow-up with some of those resources that we talked about. I know some people inquired about some of the events that will be happening around the Super Bowl. So we hope to get that information to you in short order. But thank you again to everyone for participating and have a wonderful night.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.